Hey everybody, I would like to take some time to talk to you about solid waste. We've been talking a lot about aquatic pollution and chemical pollutants, maybe liquid pollutants, but let's talk a little bit about the solid waste, the trash, the stuff you throw in the trash bin. Where does it go? How does it impact our ecosystems? And what can we do to reduce it? This is something you're probably more familiar with, but solid waste technically is basically anything you throw out that isn't a liquid or gas. It could be paper, it could be plastic, and it can come from any variety of sources. It could come from a business, it could come from agriculture. A lot of it comes from domestic use. The technical term that we use for solid waste is municipal solid waste, meaning that it comes from a municipality or sort of a township or county. And that, again, can come from households, businesses, farms, institutions, etc. So if you see the term MSW, I'm basically just referring to trash, well, basically. So, believe it or not, the amount of waste that a nation produces is correlated strongly to its wealth, or at least the size of its economy. On the x-axis here, we've got the amount of waste generation in kilograms per person per day. And on the y-axis, we've got GDP per capita, which is basically a measure of the nation's wealth. And as you can see, that as the amount of waste correlates strongly to the amount of wealth. Wealthier countries waste more. Why is that? Well, in wealthy countries, particularly the United States, we've seen some dramatic changes in the past few decades. First of all, we moved towards more advanced technology, and access to increased energy sources allow us to produce fancier pieces of equipment and also products that we use regularly, like water bottles or what have you. But more majorly is there's been a significant cultural shift towards convenience and speed rather than doing something that might take a little bit more time but involves reusing things. The era of the plastic water bottle has really only been the past 20 years or so, and before that, it was very uncommon to see bottled water. Not to mention, a lot of companies are able to externalize their costs to the environment, right? They don't have to worry about paying for polluting the environment. And additionally, the amount of waste that wealthy countries like the US produces is actually going to have impacts on developing countries, because the United States exports most of our waste, believe it or not, to China. And China proceeds to do whatever. China has a huge waste collection. That's a big part of their economy, and something we spend a lot of money on is shipping our waste over to China. And in many cases, they just end up dumping it into the ocean. But the waste that we do produce is a lot of it is paper and cardboard, about 27%. A lot of it is food waste, which I'll talk about later. But this, we could knock that whole chunk out. Yard trimmings, again, we could knock that whole chunk out. These two chunks, 28% just with composting. And plastics. Plastics make up a huge component of what we're throwing out all the time. A lot of single-use plastics, things that you buy, you use once. The average lifespan of a single-use plastic is about 20 minutes from the moment it's bought. So you buy it, and then chances are within 20 minutes it's going to end up in the trash. Pay attention to the plastic in your life, and you'll see that this is the case. Here are some interesting stats on how much waste is produced in the US. 186 billion pieces of junk mail, enough carpet to cover Delaware every year, 6 metric tons of construction debris, enough tires to circle the planet 3 times a year. This crazy how much trash we produce in the US. Where does it all go? And that's where we start talking about the impacts on the environment. The most common form is the landfill. You've probably seen one before. It's basically a big pile of trash. They bury it in the ground, and then in theory, the idea is that it's going to decompose over time. But decomposition rates depend on the type of trash that's in there and the conditions within the landfill. Is there oxygen? Is it moist? Is there organic matter in there as well? Landfills can contaminate groundwater. If water passes through the landfill, the water can pick up harmful pollutants, toxic chemicals, and as it leaves the landfill and seeps into the groundwater, it can contaminate it. And the decomposition can also release greenhouse gases like CO2 and methane, methane being much worse than CO2. Now, decomposition in a landfill varies, right? If you've got something like paper or organic matter, like an orange peel or something, that's going to decompose relatively quickly. But things like plastic bottles will take 450 years or more. Glass bottles will take thousands of years to decompose because they're not organic matter. But ultimately, so it's going to depend not only on the type of trash in there, but also the conditions of the trash heap. If there's no oxygen in it, you're going to have anaerobic decomposition, which will produce methane. If there is oxygen, you'll have aerobic, which will produce CO2, and those move at different rates in different landfills. This is crazy. This is Puente Hills landfill in California. It is the largest municipal solid waste landfill in the United States. It's also the largest man-made structure in the world, larger than the Great Wall of China. And in fact, it can be seen from space. It has its own ecosystem. It has its own nature preserve. The waste, the methane that is produced is burned to power 100,000 homes in the LA area, I believe. And it's composed currently of about 130 million tons of waste, which is about 15 million elephants. This thing is huge. So crazy landfill, pretty cool, but also not cool at the same time. A sanitary landfill has a couple of parts. Don't worry too much about this, but I just want to highlight some of the main parts. First of all landfills have a liner to prevent any leaching of pollutants into groundwater. It could be made of clay, which has a very low permeability. It could be made of plastic. It also is going to have a cap on top of it to prevent too many gases from escaping, because you want to be able to collect that gas, that methane, from decomposition so you can burn it. Any water that does go through and become leachate, which is just water that has passed through the landfill and picked up toxic chemicals, that will be collected and eventually treated to reduce the risk that it plays to groundwater. And as I mentioned before, this is a system to recover some of that methane and potentially burn it. So that's what a landfill generally looks like. Here's another picture showing similar thing. Some landfills don't accept things. I call them no-no items, because that's not the scientific name, of course, there isn't really one. But if they're not accepted at landfills, that's going to mean that people are possibly incentivized to dispose of them illegally. It could be hazardous waste, but it could also be something like tires. Many landfills don't accept tires, so they will pile up over time and fill with water and can lead to breeding grounds for mosquitoes, which can increase spread of diseases like malaria or Zika virus, West Nile virus, Tripoli, you name it. There in Greenwich, there's a facility called the Holly Hill Resource Recovery Facility, and that's where all of your trash goes. Anything you recycle goes to one section, and anything you put in the trash bin goes here. And what they do is they incinerate that trash, they burn it to produce electricity, which powers about 1% of Connecticut. But they're a resource recovery facility. And here's a list of all the things that they accept that they will recycle or reuse or recover, basically not incinerate. Batteries, books, mattresses, tires, scrap metals, electronics, fluorescent light bulbs, motor oil, yard waste, you name it. The problem is, if you just throw this stuff in your trash can, they're not going to sort through it and pick it out. So you have to bring it in separately. If you've got a bunch of tires you want to dispose of, you have to take it into the facility. It's on the consumer. It's their responsibility to sort out this special stuff. But all of these things could be removed from the trash cycle if you take them to Holly Hill. The things they don't take: commercial medical waste, hazardous wastes, prescription medicines, and boats. They don't take boats. So I know a lot of you were planning to recycle boats, but sorry, you can't do it at Holly Hill. So things like Holly Hill can help us reduce the size of landfills. What else can we do to reduce landfills? Well, firstly, we want to reduce. We want to reduce the amount of trash that we produce. That's going to reduce the size of landfills. We also want to maybe look into restoring the landfill's habitat and turning them into parks. We could capture the methane that comes from the landfill, burn it to heat water, to produce steam, which turns a turbine and turns electricity, or we could just incinerate the waste, burn it. That's what Holly Hill does. And that produces, believe it or not, Holly Hill does, it produces 1% of Connecticut's electricity. Problem is, it's going to produce particulate matter and air pollutants and ash that can lead to some issues with human health and respiratory illnesses. Another major issue that we see with landfills is electronic waste. This is discarded electronic devices like cell phones, computers, laptops, TVs, you name it. There are a lot of rare metals inside these devices, inside the circuit boards, but there are also heavy metals and toxic chemicals like barium, arsenic, mercury, and those can leach from the landfills into groundwater. Majority of the toxic leaching that happens in a landfill is from e-waste. So again, when we look at how can we reduce the amount of e-waste going in, the first thing we need to do is reduce our consumption of them. Stop buying the new phone every single year, try and keep the same phone for as long as you can. If not, try and reuse it, right? Sell it to somebody else or give it as a hand-me-down or recycle it. That's the last option. And I believe Apple has a recycling program. You can mail the phone in. I did that with mine and they sent me $70 for it. So it's worth doing that rather than just disposing of it. Some places don't use landfills. Some places dump their waste into the ocean. China is one of the biggest offenders, as well as Philippines and Indonesia. This contributes to large garbage patches in the ocean, like the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. The plastics and other waste can entangle wildlife. One of the biggest issues are old fishing nets that get dumped there that can entangle wildlife. Wildlife can also choke and die on them. I'm gonna not put the photos in because they're pretty grisly and I'm sure you've seen them before. But lots of different trash ends up inside of the ocean. Straws are a big part of it, right? But cigarettes are also big, water bottles, soda bottles, food wrappers, you name it. Any of those single-use plastics can very easily end up in the ocean. So what the heck are we supposed to do about these problems? The landfills, the incineration, the pollution going into the water. Well, believe it or not, there's a lot that can be done. And in order to answer that question, I want you to think a little bit about this. If you walk into the kitchen and you see your sink overflowing, what is the first thing that you're going to do? For me, the first thing that I would do is I would shut the sink off. And that's what we need to do. If we've got all this trash that is pouring into the ocean and pouring into the landfills, what do we need to do? We need to stop the input of trash, right? And that comes down to reducing. This is a pyramid showing in green the most favored options and in red the least favored options to addressing the trash production in the United States and the world. The best thing we can do is prevent and minimize trash. The worst thing we can do is dispose of it or burn it. If you notice, recycling's not that green. Recycling is good, it's better than throwing it out, but there are much, much more important things we can do, right? Like recycling is the equivalent of taking this water, scooping it up off the ground and, using it to flush your toilet or take a shower, rather than shutting off the sink, right? That's the first thing I would do. I wouldn't grab a mop or bucket, I would shut off the sink. And so that's what we need to focus on, is reducing the amount of stuff we produce, but also that stuff that we buy and eventually throw out. Buy less stuff. Buy less stuff. It's simple. And after that, you can look at this packaging, right? All this unnecessary packaging that comes in Amazon orders, you can reduce all that, but you can also reuse things. Think about hand-me-downs, going to thrift stores, reusable shopping bags, reusable water bottles, making a bench out of old skis, whatever it is, it's not going into the landfill, it's serving another purpose, which is great. Lastly, we can recycle. This is when we process the waste and convert it into something new. This is better than throwing it out. It reduces demand, it consumes fewer raw materials, it reduces pollution emissions, but it's very expensive. It requires energy. It's hard to scale on very large levels. The United States is not doing a great job with it. Many of the plastics that we produce aren't recyclable. And the biggest one, I think, is that it leads to a false sense of security. Lots of people recycle and they think, oh, I'm doing my part, I'm not producing waste. When in actuality, if you look at the different types of plastics, there are 7 different types of plastics. Plastics number 1 and 2 are the only ones that can be recycled. Many things, many types of plastics cannot be recycled, and people who are recycling them anyway think that they're maybe having a lower impact when they're really not. Again, remember, recycling is not the best thing that we can do. We really want to reduce, minimize, and then reuse first. That's why we say it in that order: reduce, reuse, recycle, because reducing is the best option. Um, how much of our waste is actually recycled, though? About a third of it, which is good. It's better than throwing it out, but a lot of that is paper and food waste. Food waste falls into a special category where we can actually compost it, and that composting is basically controlled decomposition. It makes a nice humus or topsoil that you can use to fertilize your garden. You can compost food, you can compost newspapers, yard trimmings. It doesn't matter. The only downside is it smells and it can lead to rats, but I compost and I don't really have those issues. Composting is good, but it's not the best, right? This is a hierarchy of what should we do to minimize food waste. The worst thing you can do with food waste is throw it out. The second worst thing you can do with food waste is compost it. The best thing that you can do to reduce food, to limit food waste, is to just produce less food, buy less food. The second best thing you can do, if you've got leftover food, then we should be feeding it to people who need the food. And if we fed all those people, then we should feed it to animals. Then we should maybe convert it into biofuel. And then we should compost it, and anything we can't compost, we should throw out. This is a hierarchy. The closer you are to the top, the better an option it is. So the best thing we can do to reduce food waste is reduce food production and food consumption. 40% of all food in the United States is wasted. I mean, so just buy less food. Other forms of recycling that are be done on a corporate level, not related to food waste specifically, but Patagonia has a recycling program. You can return the clothes and recycle them. Nike's got a program where they turn old shoes into new soles. So there are lots of great recycling programs that are being done on business level with individual businesses. There's cool products being developed. Here's a sink made out of tires. But what you need to do, the biggest thing, is focus on shutting off that sink, right? Reducing the input of pollution, buying less stuff. Once you cut down on the amount of stuff you buy, try reusing things. Reuse a bag, reuse the bottle, reuse stuff that you might not think of, right? Try not to buy new clothes every season, right? Support companies that help reduce waste and that have committed to recycling programs or limited packaging in their products. And unique to our community, we can take all those special recyclables to the Holly Hill facility. Batteries, electronics, mattresses, etc., tires, you name it. You can take those to the facility. Maybe we can start a collection at school to make it easier for people to bring those in, and then someone can take them to the facility and dump them off. But anyway, please focus on reducing the amount of stuff that you buy, reducing the amount of trash you produce, and reusing whatever you can produce. That's all I got for you, and I will see you some other time.